I know the old timers mined out a small section of the property and they pulled out $2 million worth of gold. So the gold here should be pretty good in spots.
Freddy Martinez had 48 hours before losing everything. In 2 days, the bank would pull the claim, the equipment would be gone, and 3 years of chasing a dream in the frozen north would end in silence. What waited instead, hidden under 12 feet of ancient ice, was nearly $80 million in frozen gold and something under the ground that never should have been disturbed. And before the story reveals how it all turned around from eviction notices to an underground vault of glowing nuggets, make sure to smash the like button and subscribe, because this discovery is one that should not be missed. On that Tuesday morning, the scene around Freddy already looked like failure. Repossession trucks crawled over the snow, chains clinking as they dragged bulldozers, excavators, and generators toward the road. Each piece of machinery represented another loan payment missed, another season of bad luck, another night spent staring at numbers that never added up. Freddy stood with a crumpled eviction notice in gloved hands and a bank balance sitting at roughly $17,000, the last thin line between a man and homelessness in a place where winter did not forgive mistakes. His breath shook in the air, not only from the -30 cold, but from the thought of heading south in defeat. South meant returning to an ex-wife in Phoenix who had already warned that this gamble would end badly. South meant facing his 8-year-old daughter, Emma, who had drawn a picture of mountains and gold nuggets and told everyone her dad was going to strike it rich. That drawing, worn soft along the folds, sat tucked in his wallet, the colors fading from being pulled out every time the work felt pointless. The repo operator, a Yukon local who had seen too many busted dreams, locked the last chain and suggested leaving the territory before the cold finished what the bank had started. Those words hung in the air like frost, but Freddy barely heard them. Snow crunched behind him. A figure emerged from the tree line, cheeks burned red by the cold, arms wrapped around a thick folder as if it were the only thing keeping the person upright. Juan Kowalski walked into the clearing with the expression of someone who had just found either salvation or a new way to die. The folder held survey sheets, satellite prints, old photocopies, and something that made every hair on Freddy's neck stand on end. A single name scrawled across the top page in shaky handwriting: Aurora Creek. Among miners in that region, that name was not spoken casually. Old-timers crossed themselves when it came up. Stories about that stretch of frozen ground never ended with simple bad luck. They ended with missing gear, shattered mines, and crews that left in the middle of the night without taking their pay. Freddy, standing in a yard emptied of machines, with a life compressed into $17,000 and one battered pickup, heard that name and understood exactly how desperate he had become.
Aurora Creek was not just another dot on a map. It was one of those places that lived in whispers, half legend, half warning. Juan's obsession with it came from his grandfather, Stefan Kowalski, a government surveyor who had spent the 1960s flying into remote northern valleys that most people would never see. Stefan's job had been simple on paper: mark boundaries, log mineral anomalies, and bring back neat reports that could sit in filing cabinets for decades. Somewhere in the middle of that routine work, he stumbled onto documents from a forgotten 1902 Norwegian expedition. 3 prospectors whose names barely survived in archives: Erik Janssen, Nils Anderson, and Olaf Lindfist. According to the dry official reports, those men had mapped promising creek beds, then died in their cabin from a faulty stove that filled the room with fumes. The file marked the case as an accident, stamped it, and moved on. Stefan saw more than the official version. Before those records were sealed away, he read the final journal pages. The hand-drawn maps showed a narrow valley where streams forked and braided, and where test pans scanned off the charts for gold. Sketches of nuggets, crudely shaded, were described as the size of goose eggs. The tone shifted from excitement to something else. Notes spoke of being watched at night by shapes that never stepped fully into the light. Scratched lines described sleeplessness, hearing the ground creak and shiver as if the frozen soil did not like being disturbed. The last entries focused less on ore grades and more on fear, on a feeling that the valley itself wanted the men gone. Stefan repeated those stories to a young Juan like bedtime warnings. Most kids grew up hearing about monsters in closets. Juan grew up hearing about watchers in the trees and a creek that ate miners. Decades later, when affordable satellite imaging became available, Juan combined childhood memories with modern tools. On his laptop, color-coded thermal overlays wrapped around old scanned maps from the 1960s. Underground water channels on the thermal images lined up almost perfectly with the hand-drawn 1902 survey sketches, where the Norwegians had drawn dark clusters to mark exceptional gold. The modern map showed something stranger. A long band of ground locked under about 12 feet of permafrost, colder and denser than everything around it. Some climate models suggested that ice layer might have formed during one of the last big cold snaps after the last ice age, remaining frozen while centuries of storms and summers passed overhead. Any gold trapped beneath that ancient lid would have been perfectly preserved, untouched by a century of miners working easier ground. For Juan, the implications were obvious. One shot, one buried river of frozen gravel loaded with metal that no one else had managed to reach. For Freddy, the calculations were more emotional. That buried creek represented a chance to climb out of debt, to keep a promise to a daughter who believed in him, and to avoid spending the rest of life explaining why the dream of the North had ended in repossessions and apologies. The only problem was that everyone who knew anything about Aurora Creek insisted that ground never gave up its secrets without taking something back.
The first serious pushback to the Aurora Creek plan came from someone who understood those warnings better than anyone, Parker Schnabel. Parker had spent 15 years working claims up and down that territory, following in the footsteps of a grandfather who had made and lost fortunes throughout the Klondike. Word spread fast in mining communities, carried by mechanics, fuel drivers, and bored cooks at roadside diners. Within days of Juan and Freddy discussing Aurora Creek with local suppliers, the rumor that two nearly broke miners were about to tackle the legendary frozen creek reached Parker's crew on a claim to the south. Parker arrived at Freddy's place with his foreman Mitch and mechanic Danny, eyes narrowed as they studied the maps spread across a scarred kitchen table. As soon as Aurora Creek appeared under the coffee stains and pencil marks, Parker's jaw clenched. Old memories surfaced, stories told by a grandfather who had seldom admitted fear, yet treated this one location like a cursed patch of earth. Years earlier, multiple well-funded crews had tried to work that exact stretch of ground. The Morrison brothers, experienced miners with proper equipment and experienced crews, had spent 6 weeks there in the 1980s. They had moved trailers in, laid out fuel tanks, and started cutting into the permafrost with state-of-the-art gear for the time. Then, without warning, everything stopped. One dawn, neighboring camps woke up to find Aurora Creek silent, machinery sitting where it had been parked the evening before. The Morrisons were gone. No formal explanation ever circulated. The story that filtered through the bars and bunkhouses later spoke of something being wrong with the ground, with the air, with the way night fell in that valley. Parker listened to Mitch, his crew chief, as he pointed at the thermal data Juan had brought. The creek bed was not just cold, it sat in a natural bowl that trapped heavy air. Cold air, denser than warm air, slid down the slopes and pooled in the lowest spots. In summer, when other valleys thawed, Aurora Creek remained locked several degrees below freezing at the surface and dramatically colder deeper down. Danny, who had spent a career repairing machines ruined by bad conditions, pointed out how the terrain allowed any rising warmth to slide away while cold air remained trapped. The landscape itself looked as if it had been shaped specifically to keep that ground frozen. Parker laid out the risks in practical terms. Equipment would fail faster under those extremes. Fuel costs would spike. Maintenance would double. Access roads would become dangerous in storms, and rescue would take hours even if everything went perfectly. Most importantly, there was the unknown factor, the one his grandfather had never explained clearly, the feeling that the place did not want people there. For a logical miner, that should have been enough to move on. For Freddy, standing on the edge of financial ruin, it sounded more like a dare. He had already watched the safe path disappear. When a person has only $17,000 left between a dream and total collapse, a choice between guaranteed failure and a narrow, dangerous chance at survival does not feel like a choice at all. While Parker laid out every reason to walk away, Freddy and Juan kept circling back to the same thought. The richest ground in a region is often the ground everyone else has given up on. The decision formed almost silently between them. Aurora Creek would be attempted, regardless of warnings, regardless of old stories. The territory's most feared creek was about to face one more set of stubborn miners who believed desperation could be turned into opportunity.
The first days at Aurora Creek were lesson in humiliation. The camp they threw together looked nothing like the sprawling operations of major companies. It was a patchwork of rented equipment, salvaged parts, and a small crew willing to work for percentages instead of fixed wages. Snow machines hauled in a modest excavator, industrial heaters, and a steam system designed for normal frozen ground. On any regular claim, that setup would have been enough to start peeling back overburden and exposing pay dirt. At Aurora Creek, the permafrost barely reacted. Hydraulic hammers that usually cracked rock bounced against the ice like toys, leaving shallow scuffs instead of fractures. Steam lines meant to inject heat into frozen layers clogged and froze solid within minutes, no matter how carefully they were insulated. The excavation buckets scraped and sparked against a surface that felt more like armored glass than soil. Each 12-hour shift burned fuel, wages, and precious time, while the depth gauge barely moved. Juan's discomfort grew with every failure. The numbers in his notes did not match the behavior of the ground. Temperature readings stayed lower than expected, even directly under heaters. The ice seemed to conduct cold upward as fast as heat tried to push downward, like some gigantic thermal mirror rejecting every attempt to warm it. After 3 days, frustration turned to alarm. The camp ledger told a blunt story. Tens of thousands of dollars in rental fees and fuel had already gone into the effort, and in return, the crew had earned only a few shallow scars on the permafrost and some frostbite on exposed cheeks. The initial budget, built on tight assumptions and hard bargaining, began to crack. More powerful tools were brought in next. Military surplus heaters originally built for pipeline projects arrived, along with steam injectors designed for Arctic oil wells, and experimental thermal lances borrowed from contacts who owed favors. Each upgrade represented more debt, more promises, more leverage over any possible payday. Yet even with this arsenal, the permafrost remained stubborn. Penetration depth increased slightly, but still measured in inches instead of the feet needed. The ground gave up only the most superficial layers, as if allowing a small surface sacrifice while protecting what lay below. After 2 weeks, roughly $18,000 had evaporated into the cold air and muddy slush around their machines. The camp began to resemble a graveyard of equipment, hoses frozen in twisted shapes, burned out heating units, and metal scarred by ice that refused to soften. Freddy stood in the middle of that wreckage one night, breath turning into crystalline fog as he stared at a flat stretch of unbroken ground. The worn drawing from Emma rested in his hand again. The mountains she had colored did not resemble the brutal ridges of the real north, but they carried the weight of a child's belief that her father would bring back stories of triumph, not excuses. Thoughts drifted toward giving up, toward selling what little remained and heading back to warmer streets and safer jobs. While those doubts pulled at Freddy, Juan attacked the problem from a different angle. Inside a heated shack cobbled together from plywood and tarps, he spread textbooks on seismology, acoustics, and material science across a workbench. His background in seismic engineering had always made him think in waves rather than brute force. If heat could not break the ice effectively, perhaps vibration could. The idea grew. Instead of trying to melt the permafrost, it might be possible to shake it apart. Crystal glass shatters under the right frequency even without physical impact. Permafrost, despite its toughness, is still a matrix of ice and sediment, full of internal stress lines. With enough power focused at the right resonance, those lines might crack. Juan began building a crude sonic array from scavenged speakers, reinforced frames, and amplifiers pushed well beyond their design limits. The setup looked more like a science fair experiment than serious mining gear, but the theory behind it came from the same physics that allowed earthquakes to liquefy solid ground. As outside equipment idled and doubts thickened in the icy air, a different kind of preparation was underway in that cramped lab, one that would soon show Aurora Creek that technology capable of unlocking its secrets had finally arrived. The breakthrough did not arrive with fanfare. It slipped into the camp on an early morning when exhaustion blurred days together and the crew had stopped expecting anything except more failure. At 3:47 a.m., the valley sat in a deep, unnatural stillness. Wind had died. Machines rested. Only the faint buzz of generators and the crunch of boots on snow broke the silence. Then, Juan's experimental system powered up. The sonic array began with a low, inaudible vibration that monitors showed as a slow wave climbing through range. A faint hum rolled across the empty creek bed, building into something that could be felt in chest and teeth rather than heard clearly at first. As frequency and power climbed together, the ice reacted. Hairline fractures, invisible at the surface, woke up and started to move. Cracks existing since the last major freeze
shifted and linked. The hum sharpened into a harsh tremor as the ground answered in its own way. A sudden, thunder-like crack split the night as a long, jagged line tore across the permafrost, cutting between flood-polished boulders and buried roots. The sound echoed off the valley walls like a distant gunshot, repeated again and again. Crew members scrambled to the site with headlamps bouncing. For the first time since the operation began, the frozen cap did not shrug off efforts to open it. It had split of its own accord. Machines lunged forward to widen the break before it could refreeze. Excavator teeth bit into newly fractured ice and, instead of skittering off, sank into it. Chunks of permafrost lifted away in slabs, exposing a layer of dark, untouched soil beneath that shimmered faintly under artificial light. The first test bucket came up heavy. As the load washed through the sluice, fine black sand slid away and bright, unmistakable flecks of metal clung stubbornly to the riffles. A single large nugget emerged, misshapen and smooth, weighing just over 2 ounces. At spot prices for gold, that one nugget represented several $1,000s. More important than its monetary value was what it suggested. That nugget came from the shallowest part of the newly opened zone, essentially the crust of what lay beneath the ice. If the top layer contained that kind of material, deeper channels might hold far more. Under the harsh beams of headlamps, the gold looked strange. The surface seemed to catch light in a way that almost suggested an inner glow, a trick of clean, high-purity metal combined with ice crystals refracting around it. For those who remembered the old Norwegian journals, this matched their descriptions of nuggets that looked alive in lamplight. Word of the breakthrough moved through the informal network of miners and suppliers with remarkable speed. A fuel driver mentioned unusual activity at Aurora Creek to a contact. A mechanic repeated a story about experimental equipment cracking permafrost. Within days, vehicles started appearing at distances that suggested their occupants wanted to watch without being seen. Drones with unfamiliar markings buzzed silently overhead, pausing to hover over the operation before drifting away. Corporate interest, that invisible predator of every successful small claim, had caught the scent. A large resource company monitoring regional reports noticed fuel consumption and supply orders spiking in a supposedly dead area. Questions began moving quietly through offices where exploration budgets were decided. In the middle of this growing attention, Parker made another calculated move. He had sent small samples of the early pay dirt to a private lab his crew trusted. The assays came back with numbers that defied expectations, grades so high they looked like typographical errors. Material from that fractured zone carried dozens of ounces of gold per cubic yard in some spots, figures that dwarfed most working mines. After seeing those results, Parker returned to Aurora Creek with his biggest excavators, a bulldozer, advanced heating units, and a proposal. His offer was straightforward. He would pour heavy equipment, experienced operators, and logistical support into the operation in exchange for a substantial share of the take. Freddy and Juan, sitting on a discovery far beyond their original capacity to exploit, agreed. The partnership turned Aurora Creek from a desperate experiment into a full-scale assault on permafrost that had remained sealed since before modern history. Machines roared, steam billowed, sonic waves pulsed, and gold began to flow. Yet with every truckload of rich gravel leaving the creek, something else was drawn closer. Not just rival miners, but people with the money and power to quietly erase entire operations when profits justified the effort.
Once the gold started pouring out in serious quantities, trouble arrived as predictably as winter night. The expanded operation transformed Aurora Creek into a hive of activity. Massive excavators carved into permafrost, weakened by Juan's sonic systems. Steam pillars rose from trenches as heaters did their work. Sluice systems clattered and growled as pay dirt washed over riffles, shedding black sand and revealing bright streaks of metal. Production numbers soared. Yards of material yielded ounces upon ounces of gold at grades that pushed the boundaries of what modern miners believed possible. In any quiet valley, such prosperity would have been miracle enough. At Aurora Creek, it became bait. The first signs that someone else was moving against the operation came through the fuel route. A driver named Tom mentioned to Parker that unfamiliar, sharply dressed individuals had begun asking detailed questions about fuel consumption, delivery schedules, and equipment locations along that otherwise unremarkable road. These were not fellow miners swapping stories. They looked and acted like professionals gathering data. Not long afterward, equipment failures escalated from frustrating to suspicious. One cold morning, several critical machines refused to start despite functioning perfectly the night before. Routine checks uncovered sand in fuel tanks, not the accidental grit that sometimes slipped in during sloppy refueling,
but carefully measured amounts poured in a way designed to circulate through the system and destroy engines over time. That kind of sabotage required planning and proximity. Later that week, hydraulic lines on a primary excavator burst under pressure, spraying fluid across the snow. Closer inspection showed surgical cuts that could not be explained by wear or random damage. Each incident aligned too neatly with the project's rising success to be coincidence. As sabotage grew more brazen, strange sensations crept around the edges of camp life. Footprints appeared around sleeping quarters on mornings when no one admitted being on night patrol. Shadows slipped through the tree line just beyond the reach of work lights, vanishing when flood lamps swung toward them. Radios crackled with bursts of static at moments when crews tried to coordinate safety checks in dangerous zones. Anxiety climbed. Crew members who had once shrugged at danger now kept rifles close whenever leaving cabins at night, eyes scanning for movement rather than admiring northern lights. The true extent of surveillance only became clear when Juan searched equipment for tracking devices and stumbled upon something far worse. Hidden under mess hall tables, inside generator housings, and taped behind control panels were small black units no larger than matchboxes. These were not cheap trackers from a hardware store. They were compact, hardened devices built to capture audio and transmit encrypted signals. Technical contacts who examined one of the recovered units off-site later confirmed that the hardware resembled gear associated with military or intelligence operations. Someone with access to advanced resources was listening to every conversation about the gold, the artifacts, and the difficulties underground. The crew now faced two enemies: a corporate-style ghost that knew every move, and an increasingly unstable landscape beneath their feet. The catastrophic moment arrived on a Friday at around 2:15 a.m. Deep underground, crews worked in a main tunnel carved into the richest part of the deposit. Support structures held back tons of frozen earth and fractured permafrost while operators guided excavators through narrow passageways lit by harsh work lights. Above ground, the valley lay under a clear, star-choked sky. Without much warning, the ground shuddered. What started as a subtle vibration became a violent jolt. A critical support already stressed by unseen shifts in ice and soil failed. The tunnel ceiling gave way in a cascading collapse. 40,000 cubic yards of frozen material, centuries in the making, roared into the excavation zone. Lights snapped out, radios screeched, and then went dead under a choking cloud of dust and ice crystals. Two miners barely escaped, crawling through narrowing gaps as the ground folded around them. Three heavy machines disappeared into the chaos, swallowed by the same permafrost they had been tearing apart. The camp above scrambled into emergency mode. Backup lighting flickered on. Rescue teams rushed toward the last known positions of their co-workers, hearts pounding not only from exertion, but from the realization of how close the incident had come to becoming a mass burial. When the dust finally settled and visibility returned, everyone expected only wreckage and grief. Instead, headlamps swept over something else entirely. The collapse had broken through into a natural chamber that had not seen light since long before any modern miner swung a pick. Walls of pale quartz, veined and streaked with rich gold, towered around the shaken crew. Layer upon layer of ancient gravel fanned out across the floor, sparkling under lamps like stars trapped in stone. It looked less like a tunnel and more like a vault, a hidden treasure room carved by prehistoric rivers and sealed away when the climate shifted. The initial devastation of lost machines collided with the awe of discovering a chamber loaded with wealth on a scale even this wild claim had not yet revealed. The mountain had cracked open, and something far older than anyone expected was now exposed to the air.
As work crews steadied nerves and assessed the damage in that newly exposed chamber, attention shifted from shattered steel to the details scattered through the gravel. Mixed with the gold-bearing rock were strange objects. Stone tools lay half-embedded in sediment, carved into shapes far too deliberate to be natural. Bone fragments carried intricate markings, clean lines arranged in patterns that did not match any known local symbols. Some implements bore microscopic traces of processed gold, suggesting a level of metallurgical understanding that should not have existed in that region thousands of years ago. Samples sent quietly to trusted analysts produced unsettling timelines. Some of the artifacts appeared to date back several millennia, long before written records described structured mining in that part of the world. Whoever had worked that chamber initially had not stumbled into it by accident. They had carved, extracted, and processed gold with methods that left traces still detectable after centuries locked in ice. The discovery turned Aurora Creek into more than a lucrative claim. It became an archaeological riddle. The presence of high-grade gold intertwined with evidence of lost mining cultures caught the attention of more than just corporate competitors. Regional authorities and academic institutions began making polite but persistent requests for information. At the same time, the pattern of surveillance around the camp changed. Some of the previously active listening devices went silent, as if their operators had decided they had heard enough. Helicopters with no visible markings passed high overhead. Environmental regulators who had been preparing strict reports suddenly slowed their efforts, as if redirected by unseen instructions. Around this time, respected elders from nearby indigenous communities arrived quietly at Aurora Creek. Without asking permission, they walked the edge of the site, burned sage, sang in old languages, and placed offerings near the freshly exposed entrances. When questioned, they did not answer with technical terms. Instead, they referred to ancient boundaries, to places where the earth had been wounded long ago and never fully healed, and to stories passed down about land that must remain undisturbed or risk waking what slept beneath. Sleep became difficult for the crew. Exhausted miners, who usually dropped into heavy rest after long shifts, found themselves jolted awake by vivid dreams of tunnels that did not exist yet, of narrow corridors pulsing with heat, of something vast shifting under layers of rock and ice. Strange, rhythmic tremors showed up on seismograph readings, small but disturbingly regular, as if a metronome had been placed deep within the earth. Technical staff initially assumed normal frost heave or settling, but the pattern repeated too neatly over too many days to fit random behavior. Temperatures recorded in the deepest part of the new chamber told a similar story. Despite the constant cold above ground, gauges began to show a slow, steady increase from below. Not enough to melt anything rapidly, but enough to raise questions. It looked as though some source of warmth sat far beneath the excavation zone, pushing heat upward through rock that should have been locked in place. Meanwhile, the financial side of the operation reached staggering milestones. Over 6 weeks of intense work, the combined output of surface and underground zones produced thousands of ounces of high-purity gold. When added to the projected value of exceptional nuggets and historically significant specimens, the estimated worth of the hoard moved into the tens of millions, extended over the full network of underground channels indicated by ground-penetrating radar. The total potential easily aligned with an $80 million figure, possibly more if all accessible sections could be safely mined. Yet that number carried an unfamiliar weight. Every new ounce pulled from the vault felt less like a reward and more like a payment on an unknown debt. The Norwegian journals had hinted at watches in the shadows and a ground that felt alive. The artifacts suggested previous civilizations had tapped these same deposits and then vanished or deliberately sealed them. The elders' ceremonies hinted that some lines should never have been crossed again. Late in the season, seismic instruments registered a cluster of microquakes beneath the Aurora Creek region, spaced at intervals too regular to dismiss. Patterns drawn from the data resembled something almost organic, like the slow contraction and expansion of a massive hidden muscle. In the deepest chambers, permafrost that had remained stable for centuries now showed tiny veins of water, thin lines where ice seemed to be melting from the bottom upward. Against this uneasy background, stacks of refined gold bars and carefully cataloged nuggets filled secure storage. On paper, the project had transformed a miner with nothing to lose into the central figure in one of the richest stories in modern prospecting. In practice, the situation felt less like a triumph than a countdown. Freddy Martinez stood at the edge of that flickering, humming camp with a fortune behind him and a restless valley under his feet. The discovery that once promised salvation now resembled a very expensive alarm clock set ages ago by hands long gone, ticking toward an outcome no one fully understood. If the gold at Aurora Creek was only the bait laid on top of something far older and far more dangerous, the real story might not be the 80 million pulled from the ground, but the cost of waking whatever stirred beneath it. For anyone fascinated by buried fortunes, lost expeditions, and real-world legends that blur the line between fact and nightmare, subscribing to Gold Era 2.0 ensures that the next wild discovery arrives the moment it drops. Hitting like, sharing the story, and staying tuned keeps this kind of investigation alive. as the search continues for the next hidden treasure that was never meant to be found.